Opacity. Opacity is a setting to control how much object is supposed to be opaque or transparent. So, in simple words, it is a setting to control the transparency of the objects which you have rendered on your HTML page. So, for example, as you can see over here, this image, which I have confined to a restricted size, this image, they turn out to be in the full color or full appearance only when I hover over them. By default, they have been set to have a less opacity. Now let's check out how I did it. So going back to the code, you can see, first of all, I've created these images and I've given them confined sizes. I've given them confined width of 300 pixels. And image being an inline element automatically appears next to each other if the width is available. By showing this page, definitely they are going to be stacked one above the other. Okay. And let's look at it that way first. So we have these images, one after the other, one stacked above the other, and I've set the sources for them. And I've set an image class which by default has a setting known as opacity. So the opacity property in CSS can be defined from zero point 0 to or 0 to 1. So it's from 0 to zero point 0.1 to 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 to 1, which is basically 0% to 100% in simple words. So let's manipulate that using that. For example, if I set it to zero point 0.8, which is nearly opaque, you can see the difference immediately. And if I again set it to, let's say, opaque level zero point 0.2, and you'll see both the images have become very blurred. And the background color of the page, which is this cornflower blue color, which I've set, that starts to bleed into the images itself. And I've applied the hover effect where I've set the opacity to 1, which automatically triggers it on hover to display the image with full opacity in it. Now, these are the properties to image, but opacity property can be used other places also. Say, for example, a div. Now, the div which I created over here is this. It's called, I've given a class name called OPDA, that is OPA div, which is basically opacity div. So, OPA div is the class I created. And I wrote the text, this is a transparent div. Let's check out the styling. So the styling I gave here is background color chocolate, which doesn't appear to be because it appears like a mixed color between the background blue and the chocolate color. I've given it a size, width, and height. Definitely, I've used display flex to display this text in exact center of the div. And finally, I've set the property opacity to it. Now let's control this opacity property using hover. I'm going to apply the pseudo plus hover to opa div, and I'm going to change the opacity to 1. So let's see what happens. I'm going to expand the screen. The moment I hover over it, it shows me its true form. That is, it has full opacity and it has zero transparency. Opacity means opaqueness, how hard or thick an object is. That is, how less likely it is to let a light pass through it. That is the physical definition of opacity in real life. Whereas transparency is the exact opposite of opacity, meaning how much of light is allowed to pass through. So in case of design rendering, how much of background can be made visible through these objects. I've applied it for this. Now over here, I had given it a simple background color and I controlled the opacity, which also led to the opaqueness control or the transparency control of the text over here. The text itself is having a size. Let's change the size of the text. I'm going to give it a font size and I'm going to give that font size to be, let's say, 25 pixels. Now it appears slightly broken, but okay. Now, if I move the mouse out of this area, you see even the text goes blur a little bit. That is, it does not appear to be absolute black anymore. It has taken sort of a tint of the background color of the page. That is, whatever the back color is in the background. So that is because I've set opacity set property to the entire div. Now in the second div, however, I have created a simple div where there's no opacity created. And this set, I'm going to control its opacity of its background color without using the opacity property. That can be done in a very simple way. Over here, let's say this div, this is the div with transparent background. So I'm going to apply transparent background. Now you do remember we had ways of defining color, the prefetched color names in CSS, the HSL mode, RGB mode, okay. We can also use something with RGBA. A stands for alpha, which means how much of transparency has to be allowed or how much of opaqueness. So when I add A, I have to also add a third property or a third number over here. First three numbers are red, green, and blue. The fourth one would be how much of an opacity has to be applied, and it is again between 0 and 1. So you can increment it by zero point 0.1. Let's say I want to set a opacity to zero point 0 for zero point 0.5, which is half the opacity. And immediately you see this div has become half opaque and half transparent. Let's also set a hover property to this where we can alternate this setting. Let me apply the full background color here, for which I'm going to use 1. Now, the moment I hover on this div, it is going to behave itself in a different way. So I'm going to apply a simple RGB property, and I'm going to apply dot. Now I had missed out the dot in mentioning the class, so my RBGA setting would have also worked. And as you can see, the hover works perfectly. To remove your confusion, I'm going to add the A property again. It did not work the first time because I had forgotten to apply the dot over here while defining the class. Here you go. In the hover, the opacity is set to 1, which means it is fully opaque. It's not transparent at all. When I remove it, it's 50% opaque and 50% transparent. There is no property known as transparent property. There is an opacity property, that is how much opaque you need it to be. All right.